Okay, it's 1:00. Are we recording now?
Recording in progress.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you all for being back. I hope you had a nice lunch and stretch break. And I'm really pleased to welcome my colleague Suzanne Kelly, the CEO of the Cipher Brief, a leading national security platform, and Dan Hoffman, who is currently a national security senior correspondent with Fox News and a former senior CIA officer, and also served on President Trump's Intelligence Advisory Board. They're going to do a question and answer interview session for about the next 25 minutes and then leave about 5 to 10 minutes for questions. So you're on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I have to just start off by saying hats off to you for your interest in sort of national security issues and how that relates to what you do professionally. Given your past, it's understandable, but I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank you to Southwestern as well. I'm having trouble talking today. It could be fun. I just want to also say that Dan Hoffman is also my interview subject, but he's also a Cipher Brief expert. And just in full transparency, we are very proud to work with Dan as we at the Cipher Brief try to figure out what events mean. We all know what happens, but we don't always know what it means. And he's one of the people who lends his expertise to helping us figure that out. So I want to get that out of the way as well. But Dan, it's nice to see you again. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on the panel.
So I thought we might start off with talking about the national security aspects of what we'll call Havana syndrome. Other people have given it different names, which I think adds to the confusion. But let's start off by talking about, this recent CIA report. It was an interim report. It seemed to create more questions than provide answers. It's been very difficult to sort of seed through what the report found, but they did say there was no sort of massive worldwide campaign. In the way that this was worded, it made it sound like they weren't ruling everything out, but they were ruling out a number of these cases that had come forward. It doesn't mean there's no problem here. What did you make of that CIA report? And then we'll talk about some of the other reports.
Yeah, I found it very uncomfortable. I felt like the CIA was kind of lifting the veil on how the CIA does analysis, but mid-process. So they were making conclusions, but they were of an interim nature. And you're right, they said that they ruled out what we call Havana syndrome in like 1,000 cases. There were still 24 cases that were unresolved. To me, it just meant unresolved. I think the interim report, frankly, caused more consternation and more questions than it did kind of clear up what we think might be happening.
So I agree with you. It seemed to me like a case of almost burying the lead, which is those 24 unresolved cases, which they're still, you would assume, actively looking for answers for. I'm curious, though. So on a broader sort of national security level, we had in this morning's Cipher Brief Open Source Report podcast, which is where we sort of comb through all of the headlines of the day and things that are going on around the world. The fact that Kamala Harris is getting ready to go to Europe. She's going to be appearing at the Munich security conference that's coming up this month. And she has already had an incident where there was some warning ahead that there may be an issue in previous travel. I'm wondering, how is it that both State Department officers and CIA officers are sort of getting the confidence to continue on with the fear of this? And I'm going to categorize it as sort of fear of this because we don't have answers yet being out there. How might that impact the national security mission?
I think it has a great impact, potentially. Back when he was Secretary of Defense, Secretary Gates was asked once by one of the soldiers where he'd been at a war zone he was visiting about what kept him up at night. And the soldiers expected him to say Iran nuclear program, North Korea, terrorism, whatever those key issues are that we're focused on in our national security team. And he said, no, you do. All of you people do. Because I want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to take care of you. That is the first order of business. If you're leading brave men and women who are putting themselves out there serving in harm's way to detect threats and preempt them before they're visited on our shores. And in this case, we've got people who reportedly are government officials who have been hit with these anomalous health incidents, Havana syndrome, in Asia, in Europe, obviously in Cuba, In Russia, very clear example there, Mark Polymeropoulos, who had to retire from the CIA, and including reportedly staff of Director Burns when he traveled, staff of Vice President Kamala Harris. So all of that, and the fact that there's no resolution and no clear indication of what's going on, causes people to be concerned, causes their families to be concerned. I can tell you, I spent 3 years in war zones overseas, and that drove my family batty, when I was overseas, and I could only imagine the trauma, frankly, for family members, knowing that their loved ones are in harm's way, and that makes it hard to do your job.
It is one of the greatest fears, I think, is fear of the unknown. And unfortunately, there are still a lot of unknowns around this issue in particular. And I'm glad you mentioned Mark, because my colleague, Greg Myrie, is going to be talking with him after our session today. But let's just drill down for a second. I'm curious, there have been sort of early on some ideas out there that, and we'll say from informed sources, that there may be a nation state behind this, that Russia may be behind this. And there are a number of reasons why people are coming to that conclusion. Just given and understanding that you don't have immediate access to the classified information that is there today. But what would make you think that this would be some sort of nation state coordinated effort?
Yeah, so my initial reaction way back when we first detected these attacks in Cuba was that this just smelled of some Russian cloak and dagger asymmetric espionage operation. The Obama administration had developed a new line of policy on Cuba where we were going to establish relations, and that would have caused Russia a lot of concern. They would have wanted to break that up, and one way to do it would be to hit our people with these electropulse magnetic microwaves in Cuba. And of course, we blamed the Cubans and closed our embassy, which is exactly what the Russians would want. Vladimir Putin, we know him. His formative experience was serving in the KGB. So this is what he does. And having a capability like this would give him leverage in his relationship with the United States. He can't go toe-to-toe with us, not with an economy the size of Italy's. No disrespect to the Italians, but Russia just doesn't have that ability. But where he levels the playing field is with espionage operations, and he's doing it worldwide. He's interfered in our elections. He's mounted all sorts of cyber attacks against us and our allies. He used banned chemical nerve agent against Sergei Skripal in the UK with absolutely no concern about causing harm to innocent civilians and passersby who were also in harm's way. So those are just a few examples. I mean, downing a Malaysian airliner. It's just, this is what Vladimir Putin does. So it was something that I could certainly see him doing, but you've got to go out and collect the intelligence to confirm. Otherwise, it's just a theory.
Exactly right. I think we can all agree that the Russian president is a great strategist, but that's not evidence. And that's been one of the issues with getting to the bottom of this, hasn't it? The fact that it's very difficult to catch anyone in the act, which is almost what you need to do, it seems like, as the intelligence community kind of digs in on this. What are some of the issues at play there with gathering evidence? And in a case like this, where it may be focused directly on U.S. diplomats or U.S. intelligence officers who are working in embassies, but there's really very little to go on. So I'm starting to understand why it's so difficult for the government to go out there with statements they might not know. Is that possible?
So I think what the government has done a good job of is looking at the forensics. That is, people who have been hurt and getting them into Walter Reed. I mean, we haven't been perfect at that, and it certainly took a long time, but a number of people, and Mark will talk about his experience soon, but we've gotten people in for medical exams, and that's forensics. That's helping us understand what they might have been subjected to. But then we need to collect intelligence to determine who's doing it in the first place. And I kind of liken this to, some of the hunting for spies that I was involved in at CIA. We knew that we were losing our sources, for example, in the Soviet Union and in Russia, but we didn't exactly know why. And it wasn't until we collected the most sensitive intelligence we were able to prove it was Rick Ames or Robert Hansen. That's kind of what this is. Now, I'll caution everyone that intelligence doesn't deliver certainty. Just look at the Abbottabad raid where we killed bin Laden. We weren't certain he was there. You've got to make decisions with a level of confidence. In fact, as my old boss, Michael Morrell, former acting director CIA, likes to say, as important as what you believe is how strongly you believe it. And so we need a level of confidence of low, medium, or high that it was Russia or China, or perhaps them working together. We're assuming it's one country, could be a number of countries, could be state actors and non-state actors. Again, we just don't know. And that means that this is an intelligence gap. And until we solve it, with all due respect to my former colleagues, whom I revere and thank for their service, this is an intelligence failure. We've got to get this one figured out.
So Dan, I think you'd probably be the first to say that the intelligence community is up against a pretty hefty expectation of always finding the answers to everything, even when it's incredibly difficult. What would you say should be going on right now for those of us who don't come from the intelligence community, who don't understand the way you do the tasks that they're up against? I mean, what are some of the biggest challenges in this specific case?
Yeah, so I've done this a lot, because I've been retired a couple of years now, and I still wake up in the morning thinking, what would I do if I were still at CIA? And I miss the people, I miss the mission. So the first thing we would want to do is rally up all our stakeholders, try to seek out what we would call a 360-degree optic. That means getting our science and technology people so we could understand, the technology that might be involved in these attacks on our people. The Office of Medical Services, the folks who were telling us, well, these are the medical conditions that our officers are struggling with right now. So we understand that. We marry that up with the collection that we have that we could do against state, non-state actors, and we funnel what we call requirements to our collectors overseas in the field. And we think about, well, who would have access to the information if attacks are indeed taking place? And we would posit, for example, that the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, might be behind this. Well, then we're going to pulse our sources, and we're going to talk to our partners, our foreign liaison partners, the closest ones in NATO, for example, who may have collection on this. The Canadians obviously have also been subjected to these sorts of attacks. What are they seeing? So the idea is to collect as much intelligence as possible. Be very wary about making interim judgments. Those aren't super helpful. What is helpful is understanding what the gaps are and making this a high priority for our people to go out and collect intelligence. Critical and important.
It's interesting because Senator Warner had also come out and talked about the fact that they haven't seen any sort of like bragging about this, which is, I think, one of the ways that both law enforcement and intelligence officials are able to figure out what's going on by monitoring the chatter. What does that actually mean if they're not picking up on usual channels? Is that surprising or perplexing to you?
I don't know why he said that, frankly. Like, I don't know if we need to tell our adversaries where we're looking or what we expect to hear from them to confirm or not confirm that these attacks are taking place. That hasn't been the experience in my, look, again, if it's like a mole hunt akin to finding Rick Ames or Robert Hansen, which I think this is closest to that in terms of the challenge that we're facing in the intelligence community. Bragging isn't going to be what you're going to see. It's not going to be that. It's probably not going to be documents. It's probably going to be a source who's in the know. And one of the concerns that I have is when we say we've made conclusions, then those who are in the know are going to think, well, I don't know if I want to go volunteer this information. One of the things that's really important for our intelligence community, for CIA in particular, is to collect intelligence from volunteers, from people who show up and give us intelligence because they have access to really sensitive information and they need something in return for us. We don't want to close off any of those avenues to people. We want people to know that this is not yet solved, and we need help. It's what the FBI does. When the FBI gets a lot of tips and a lot of people coming to them with reports of criminal behavior, we kind of do the same thing at CIA, and I fear that we have kind of closed off that avenue a little bit, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And I would see how that would impact the mission overall. It is a bit of a terrifying development that, is my own personal opinion, because it's something that's hard to track. It's something that's very difficult to know who's behind it. And it is having an impact. Clearly, there are dozens of cases that they haven't figured this out yet. And those people are suffering from very real symptoms. So until we figure this out, it's almost the perfect weapon in a lot of ways. You mentioned that you closely align it to kind of the hunt for moles. But Dan, what are some of the outstanding sort of challenges in this one that may be different from the hunt for a mole, where you've got communications you can monitor. You may have other electronic things that you can monitor to try to track someone down. On the financial side, what are some of the unique challenges with this particular case?
Yeah, so, the way we might catch a mole that is a spy in the U.S. government, you don't catch a spy unless you've got a spy in your adversary's intelligence service telling you who the spy is. But because we believe in due process in the United States, if you look back over the history of how we caught Rick Ames, yes, we might have known it was Rick Ames, or at least believed he was the suspect, but we went and did years of collection on him to prove the case. Because as I said, nothing in intelligence is a certainty. What concerns me here is, and again, to get back to why there's the potential that this is a state actor, it looked to me like specific U.S. government officials were being targeted at specific times and specific places. And what that could mean, if I'm thinking as a dark sider, somebody who served decades at CIA and spent many years on the Russia target and served many years in Russia, what it could mean is that other sources are reporting to a state actor like Russia on where our people are, what their travel is, who is where they're going to be, and where, therefore, they might be particularly vulnerable to this sort of attack. That's what kind of caused me concern, and also made me concerned that there really was some state actor behind this. This isn't indiscriminate. In other words, a terrorist attack can be very focused on a particular place, as we saw on 9/11, but it's indiscriminate in the sense that there wasn't a specific person targeted on 9/11. It was our nation and a specific location. Here we're seeing specific individuals, and Mark will talk about that in the next session. And that takes a state actor with an intelligence service, typically. Now, again, I'm making an assumption. I would say I have a medium level of confidence on that if we're going to give you one. But that's where we need more collection and a lot of thinking, and also maybe even some red teams. Think about, if you go back, we know a number of these cases, let's say the 24 that are unresolved. We'll go back, I'm hoping we've done this, and look at them historically and try to understand how, where the vulnerable points were and how our adversary could have mounted these sorts of attacks against us, and go to our foreign liaison government intelligence partners and work these cases with them.
It seems to me too, one sort of blaring fact out there that I'm sure everyone is paying attention to is that so far it seems to only be U.S. citizens who are the victims of these kinds of attacks that develop these symptoms that have been reported, which does seem to kind of fall into the circumstantial, maybe, but pretty strong circumstantial evidence that Americans are being targeted for this. What do you think is going to happen if, and this is a bit of speculation on this case, but I think it's important in kind of fleshing out the bigger national security threat. What do you think is going to happen if this goes on for another couple of years and whoever is behind this is seeing that there's really no downside to continuing attacks like these because no one can catch them?
Yeah, I mean, for everyone who thinks that this is just these anomalous health incidents and they're not, and it's not a state actor. Remember, the Biden administration, President Biden warned Putin not to do it at their summit in Geneva. So it is an issue there. And the longer it carries on, obviously, the greater concern we have for our people and the fact that it's not resolved. And the one thing about that when you think about the state actors that would think about doing this to us, I'll leave it to a lawyer, but it certainly looks like an act of war to me. And so you kind of have to have nuclear weapons if you're going to do this, because we know we're not going to war with Russia over this. But what we might like to do is catch one of their bad guys in the act, as we've done with their illegals, going back, for example, in 2010, catch them in the act, throw them in jail, and then have a more serious conversation with the Russians. But we're certainly not going to go to war over this, even though you might argue that that's exactly what this is. But yes, the longer it goes on, as you correctly point out, it's taking up our time, and in the intelligence community, there's an opportunity cost. If we're doing this, then we might not be doing something else, and Vladimir Putin would know that as well.
Also, that's a really important point to consider, Dan. Why the confusion over sort of how this has been reported and how these different reports are coming out at different times with different bits and pieces of information? Why all the confusion?
I just don't think we're coordinating on our message very well. And I think, honestly, I say this as a concerned citizen, I'd like to see the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, managing how the administration speaks out on this, why the CIA had an interim report, and then the DNI had a report that seemed to contradict a little bit of what the CIA said. I just don't quite grasp that. It just makes things look a bit disjointed, and that's not good for the folks on the inside who are the ones doing the hard work on our behalf, in tough places. So yeah, I guess it's over to the White House to kind of fix the messaging on this and make sure. And I think our elected representatives, with all due respect, Senator Warner included, be careful what you say and where you speculate, because we're all listening carefully, including the people who have been subjected to this trauma.
I think especially those people and their families also who have in some cases been subjected to this as well. It does seem like in my decade of covering Washington and in particular the intelligence community that there is usually an explanation that is human in nature, that there was a failure to coordinate a report. Someone dropped the ball somewhere. That is a much easier explanation to accept than anything sort of more sinister. We have heard when the current CIA director came into office that this was going to be a priority for him. And there may have been, and now we're in pure speculation territory, but there may have been some pressure to produce something because people have been waiting for answers. It's all around a very difficult situation. But Dan, I just want to go back one more time to sort of like, you did work in Russia, you did work in Moscow, and you have that suspicious mind by nature, given, your past as an intelligence officer. What do you think are the next few steps that should be taken in terms of information that's needed to actually get to a point where we can see less confusion around this? We can at least agree on what's known and get those people are obviously already getting help who have been affected. And Mark will talk more about that. But what would you like to see happen next if you could choose 3 or 4 things?
So first of all, take it out of the public eye for the moment here. I think that CIA interim report could have been delivered just to CIA officers or maybe just in the intelligence community, but we don't need to air it for the public as well as to our adversaries. If we believe that an adversary is targeting us, and I certainly believe that's the case, then what we don't need to do is issue interim reports. It's like we're grading Russia's homework if they're the ones responsible, and that can only be helpful to them. It's like we're giving them our order of battle. So I would like to just, I think it's important for House and Senate oversight to be tracking this really, really closely. But I also feel like until we have something definitive, we kind of need to take this inside the IC and leave it there until there's something more definitive. And I'd still like to see a statement from Director Burns and from DNI Avril Haines that we are focusing on this issue, that we're devoting our resources to solving this mystery, because nothing matters more than taking care of our people who are now all in harm's way. And the thing about it is, maybe it's only 24 people, or maybe not. Maybe it's more. Who knows how many it is? But it's everybody, because you don't know if you're going to be the next one. So if you're going overseas, or reportedly if you're walking near the White House, because there were 2 hits of people near the White House, then you could be the next one. So it doesn't matter how few or how many of these there are. The fact that it's not solved is what is the real problem. And I think the first thing that I would like to see is manage your own workforce and deal with that. But keep the secrets for now. And the rest of us outside of the U.S. government, well, we don't need to know right now. But you need to go and do the job that you do. And we're not privy to how you do it. We don't need to see how you do it. We don't need interim reports. Just go do the job and keep us safe.
Dan, I'm going to push back on you a little bit on that respectfully, because I think this is an issue that does need to be talked about, which is, the government, if they take it out of the public eye, they're accused of hiding something and keeping secrets. If they bring it into the public eye, they're scrutinized on, is everything in place and do we have the level of confidence? Like there's an expectation level there that I think is difficult to match. We've seen recently with what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, the sort of coordinated release of intelligence. It's not a leak, but intelligence in ways that has never been done before. And I just wonder, is taking it out of the public eye the only option, or are there opportunities here to do a more coordinated release of information? or if that's not happening, would that cause just more confusion at this point?
Yeah, I just think the priority is getting to the facts and getting to what we haven't done that. We have failed to determine what's going on. And I think the priority is doing that. And I think when you shine a spotlight, I agree with your points. I would just be concerned that maybe we got to take the Hippocratic oath. This is a medical thing. Oh, don't do any harm to our collection efforts while we try to take care of our people the best we can. I totally agree with your points, and the concern now that it's out anyways in the public, and we've got people who are no longer working in the CIA or the State Department who were subjected to these attacks, and they need to be kept abreast of whatever investigation is going on. But I'm just not sure that we need to be releasing reports, interim ones especially. As far as the intelligence on Ukraine is concerned, I would just say I ran up against this a lot in Russia. You know, we lots of times our awesome State Department diplomats want to have a Cuban Missile Crisis moment, take our intelligence and share it with the Russians. And I used to say, you're going to tell them something they already know that they're doing against us to prove a point. And they like that because then they go find our sources and they cut them off, or they put a bullet in the back of their head. So you got to be really careful about when you do that. And in the case of Ukraine, just to slightly, move aside from this issue, but it's important because Vladimir Putin is the KGB operative in the Kremlin. I don't doubt that he's actually dialing up the tension against Ukraine, knowing that some of these things that he's saying that will never happen, like a fake propaganda video, will be released, and he'll be able to determine where that leak is happening and slice off that source. And he will have dialed up the tension in Ukraine, and he wins by that. So we have to remember that our adversary is pretty wily, if it is Russia, and how we manage the collection of intelligence is extraordinarily important, because with all due respect, our administration, there isn't anybody who speaks KGB. The last one who was, our last president who had served in the director of CIA was President George Herbert Walker Bush. And Vladimir Putin's just kind of different the way he manages his affairs, as we all know.
As we all know. And I think you just really perfectly highlighted how difficult the business of intelligence is overall, which I think is important for people to understand, because it may seem like from us on the receiving end of a TV report or a newspaper article that, this seems so simple, but it's never the case that it's that simple. And I don't think there's been a case more than the Havana syndrome incidents that we've seen that has highlighted just how complicated and difficult this can be. I want to have just a couple of minutes and ask Dr. Dekleva to come back in if there are questions from the audience before I use up all your time. It's fascinating.
Thank you both, Dan and Suzanne, for kind of a wonderful 30,000-foot view of how our national security community and leaders, all the way up to the president, look at this problem, which is an intelligence challenge, and as you heard this morning, a medical intelligence mystery that bedevils some of the top scientists, physicians in the country. A question, we have time for one question for Dan. Sean Guillory asks, there are a lot of stakeholders you talked about. We have a task force from Director Burns with the CIA, the State Department with Ambassadors Moore and Uyehara, and recently President Biden named Maher Bitar at the National Security Council as their lead, as sort of the czar for this. What advice would you give if you were on President Biden's Intelligence Advisory Board today on how to coordinate these stakeholders so they work together optimally along with the scientific and medical community?
If it were me, this is extraordinarily presumptuous of me in a way to think like this, but I'm going to say what I would do is I would have advised President Biden. I would have said, sir, designate someone at the NSC who is going to be responsible for this, who is going to manage our response to these attacks. Ensure that person coordinates all the different agencies, as well as all of those who have been stricken with these attacks. And here are the three questions I need answered. Who's doing it to us? How are we going to catch them? And what are we going to do to stop future attacks? Ancillary, please make sure you take care of everybody who's been attacked in this way. And anybody who says they were attacked until proven otherwise. I know one of the things that really hurts people, and Mark will talk about this, is when they're told that, no, you really weren't subjected to this Havana syndrome attack. And that's extremely painful, psychologically painful for people who have been to Walter Reed and have traumatic brain injury to be told that what they're feeling isn't actually true. So that's what I would do. Put somebody in charge and let them coordinate it. That would solve a lot of problems.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Suzanne and Dan. We're out of time. And now we're going to move on to Greg Meyer of NPR, who will interview Mark Polymeropoulos to talk about the victim impact. And Mark will talk about his treatment at Walter Reed, what happened to him, his treatment, and recommendations that he has for other persons